Hello, my name is Mary White. I'm a Bay Area artist, and I'd like to introduce Carol Benioff, a native San Franciscan painter and printmaker, a friend, and West Berkeley neighbor. Carol spent most of her adult life either in San Francisco or in the East Bay. Drawing is the underpinning of all of Carol's narrative work. She works in thematic series, often returning to a theme in a new way, in a new medium. Her experiments of combining the new medium of digital painting and the old mediums of etching, monoprinting, and painting gained her recognition both in the fine art world and book publishing world. Carol recently published Present, and her work has been exhibited in the US, Europe, and Central America. She has received the James D. Phelan Art Award in printmaking and a fellowship from the Kala Art Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce her and to ask her some questions. So the first question, Carol, is when did you realize art was your calling?
I drew in class at school, got in trouble for it, drew at home. I took art classes. I wandered in museums in San Francisco because when I was a child, the museums were actually free, so you could go to the Legion and Dion without paying. And I did go to art college, and I did receive some recognition for my art talents, you know, at home and with friends and at school. And at the time, my father was very traditional, you know, 1950s, 1960s. And he thought, you know, art was a nice hobby for me to have, but basically that I would get married and my husband would take care of me. So he wasn't really that concerned. My mother, on the other hand, had drawn as a child, and when she was at Stanford, she actually took art in English, but she really didn't pursue it. It wasn't a passion for her, but she did focus some of her art energies through me. So she signed me up for art classes and she corrected my work. So when I was younger, it was harder or more difficult for me to own the work. It was just like, was it mine? Was it hers? But also I wasn't really certain if this was the path for me. When I was younger, I kept on thinking, well, if I go this way, then I might miss out on some other opportunity somewhere else. And I couldn't really make up my mind. I took a lot of detours. After high school, I traveled. I did go to school for a while, art school. I dropped out. I did clothing design. I did costume design. And I really wasn't making art. And then in my mid-20s, I basically hit a wall. You know, nothing was really working. I was very unhappy, and I had a lot of self-destructive behavior. And so I basically dropped out of pretty much everything. And between therapy and self-reflection, I finally realized that no, art was what I wanted to do, and that it was mine, and that there were things I wanted to say with images, and I wanted to move forward in that direction. And so I owned it at that point.
Yeah, great. Well, who helped you and influenced you on the way?
My earliest influence, and it was in high school, was with Ronald Chase. He had started this pilot art program out of his studio on the Embarcadero in San Francisco. And I was invited in high school to participate in it, and I did. And it was right next door to the YMCA on the Embarcadero. And the Embarcadero was not like it is now. It was, you know, this is where the sailors stayed between shipping out, and there were a lot of drunks on the street and in Ronald's doorway. So kind of had to climb over the drunks, and you go inside and you walk up this long staircase, and inside was this beautiful, it was funky, but it had its beauty. It was airy and light. It was magical. There was one room that was a complete bird cage, and there were all these birds in it, and there was, you know, a giant big dining table, and there's a giant freight elevator you could put a car in, and he had this huge work area, and it had a lot of his pieces in it, and he did a lot of theater and opera set design, so some of his work reflected that. He did these assemblage sculptures that were photographic and painted, but they also involved mirrors and lights and double mirrors, so there was a lot of illusion that was created in the pieces. Plus, and they dealt with his family, at least at that time, from Oklahoma. You know, he really showed me, just by how he lived, that there was another way to live your life. But more importantly, what he showed me was what it was to be an artist. And it was daily practice. And it was looking at other artists, learning from the artists in the past. And it was persisting and not afraid to make mistakes and to learn from your mistakes. And I went back to him when I was at California College of Arts and Crafts. At the end of the semester, I would go call him up and I'd go visit him. And we'd spend like an hour and a half together, and I'd show him what I had done for the semester. And I got more out of that hour and a half of talking with Ronald than I had gotten in the entire semester at CCAC, which was one of the compelling reasons why I dropped out. But then later in my late 20s, when I decided, yes, I am making art again and I really want to do this, I called him up and I asked him if he would help me. And he said, yeah, I'll help you, but you're going to work. You're going to really work. And I did. He really helped me figure out what my process was. He didn't critique per se. He would ask me questions like, you know, what were you trying to do? Which was easy, which was hard? What do you want to do? But he also directed me to look at like Daumier and Goya and Rembrandt, and it was to look at them, how did they handle the figure? You know, how did they handle composition? How did they handle light, color, paint? But more importantly, how did they use all those elements to create the tone and emotion and story that they wanted to tell in their piece? And then also he really just pushed me to persist despite your failures. And the other important thing he helped me with, he said, copy other artists, you know, really copy their work. Because when you copy, you actually figure out how they put something together. And the other person who really helped me a lot was my first husband, Jim. He gave me unequivocal support, but also he kind of pushed me to have fun in the studio and not be so hard on myself, and to break the rules more, and to try to show more of myself in the work itself.
Right. Well, this kind of segues into the next question, which is the threads and choices and circumstances that shaped your voice and vision.
I think it took quite a few things to come together over decades to kind of coalesce. I always worked in self-reflective, kind of figurative narrative pieces, even as a young artist, even in school. And it was what I gravitated towards. And when I was at CCAC, when I would put up my work, it would be ignored, just walked by, or ridiculed. And even though I faced that, I still knew that that was the type of work I wanted to do. There are two other big influences. One was I had a friend, Michael Capisi, who was dying of AIDS. In the last 6 weeks or so of his life, last few months, he was at the Zen Hospice Center on Page Street in San Francisco, and I visited him almost daily. And the last 6 weeks or so, he lost his ability to speak. And I would sit and try to tell him stories, and he'd roll his big eyes like, please, please stop. Because I was driving him crazy, because I'm not a great storyteller. So then I decided, okay, I can't tell him stories, so what am I going to do? So I came back the next time, and I had a sketchbook with me, and I started drawing him as he slept or rested, or he would be watching me draw, and he would smile. And I know that, this was okay. He enjoyed that. That was a good way to visit with him. And then after he died, a friend of mine had a printmaking studio in Hunters Point, and I asked if I could come use their press because I wanted to do a series of monoprints on him. And I had drawn him prior, and I had photographs of him, of Michael prior when he was healthy. And so I did one series of him healthy and one series as he was dying. And I put those up in my studio, and Jim, my first husband, walked in, and I don't know if he clapped or yelped or what, but he just said, "These are truly yours. This is the first time that you've done something that's not an exercise. It really has something authentic that comes from you." And that was a great feeling. And I recognized it myself. I felt like this was true. And the other event that happened really close to that was I took a class at the Achenbach Foundation run by Robert Flynn Johnson that called the greatest hits of the Achenbach. And you sat in the library of the Achenbach on this giant big table, and Robert Flynn Johnson ran in the back, and he'd bring out all these prints, and they were just in mats. So you were looking at everything. There's no frames, there's no distance you're looking at. We looked at a lot of different people, but the two printmakers that I really gravitated towards were Rembrandt and Goya. And I looked at their line, and I looked at the tonality that Goya got, and I want to get that. And I asked Robert Flynn Johnson, how did they do that? Because I had etched before on zinc, and I never got that kind of line. He said, oh, well, they use Dutch Morden on copper. And I went, okay, I want to learn how to do that. And it was only like a month later, maybe 6 weeks, there was an ad in Art Week that the master printer, Karen Tassavana, who worked at Limestone Press, was going to teach a class on how to etch on copper. And I signed up. And she basically did this class. She said, one, nothing happens at night at Limestone Press. And two, nobody's ever taught how to etch on copper. They don't teach that in school. And I really took to it. I loved what I could do with it. I got the line and tonality that I wanted. And I think it's the combination of the two things is that I just realized what I wanted to focus on really were the relationships to family, to friends, to the cultural mores or social constructs that affect me, that affect other people, that, people who are discarded, or, the cost of people being silenced to the horrors that are happening in our time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we've got 3 more questions. What is your process and technical process in art making?
Well, there's a process of developing ideas, and that comes from many different sources. Some of it's just from reading, being in life, talking to people, seeing what's going on. Other sources are from my sketchbooks. I keep my sketchbooks for years, and I cull through them for ideas, but also sometimes just because there's a figure or some snippet that I pull from my sketchbook to put in a piece that it just feels like it fits there. But also when I'm working, I work thematically, and I often return to themes, and a lot of times there's a fair amount of research that goes into it. There was a series that I did quite a while ago that was on the transition from girl child to womanhood. And I did a lot of reading in the 90s about what current, young girls and young women were experiencing. And it was in some ways disheartening because it didn't feel all that different than the 1950s and 60s. I mean, there were different kinds of pressures than we experienced in the 50s and 60s, but there still was a lot of pressure that were specific to being female in this society. And I use the research basically to kind of figure out and focus on a visceral level how to express the aspects of, in that case, the difficulties that you have as a young woman growing up, the constraints, the rules, the pressures. And then, I think about what medium to use and what scale to work in. I work in a lot of different mediums. So, whether it's going to be an etching or whether it's going to be a painting, whether it's going to be some combination of multiple mediums, I almost always draw first. I don't think I ever just start. It's like I do drawings, I do gouache studies. I might, and I work on multiple pieces at the same time, because then I feel like if I get stuck, I just move on to the next one. I put it down. I can leave it there for a while. I think the hardest thing I know for me is knowing when to stop and saying, okay, this is done. That's really hard.
Yeah.
I often have turned pieces into mud because I didn't know when to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, which artist's work do you seek out for help?
I have a fair amount of artist friends also who come into my studio, and that helps a lot because we talk about, current issues with whatever I'm working on. I always go back to Goya. I'm constantly looking at Goya. And the artists that I go to change over time. I look a lot at Paula Rego, a lot for this psychological timbre that she evokes in her work, for some of how she handles the figure. I recently saw the David Park show. I hadn't really seen much of his work prior, and I really enjoyed it for his handling of paint, for the way in which he composed his pieces, so how he led the viewer into the piece, and the simplicity, that it was just very simple. Deceptively simple, I should say. And then I look at Otto Dix, I look at Bruegel, I look at Tintoretto, I look at Kiki Smith, Paula Mortensen-Becker, Degas for composition and monoprints. And William Kentridge, Giacometti, Blake. There's a whole, I look at different people for different things.
Yeah, beautiful. What keeps you going making art? That's our last question.
Okay. For me, I cannot not be making images. I feel out of sorts if I'm not doing it. So even when I was working full time and taking care of my partner when he was really ill, even if I wasn't able to work consistently, I at least drew. I might have just been drawing him or drawing in my sketchbook, but there was some thread that always went through. And also I get surprised by, the different ideas that I come up with, that I still come up with ideas, and that there might be new ways that I find to work. And I think more importantly, it's like when I'm actually working, it's a different state of being. It's not normal. It's not busyness. It's you're out of yourself. At least for me, I come out of myself. And for me, drawing always was like that. It really felt like I was drawing something out of myself, but also culling it from the atmosphere or from just sources. And I don't always know what's going to happen. And it's like you both have control from your skill, and then you don't have control. And then there's the happy accidents too that happen that are wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was wonderful and learned a lot.
You're welcome.